What does it mean when the past refuses to stay buried? Not in the romantic sense of old ruins and broken statues, but in a quieter, more unsettling way. A wall that should have crumbled still stands in salt water after 2,000 years. A blade forged by vanished hands still seems to carry a logic modern furnaces cannot fully imitate. A fragment of glass found in the desert catches the light as if some forgotten event had frozen fire itself and left it behind for us to find. We like to imagine history as a ladder, each generation climbing a little higher than the last. It is a comforting picture. It tells us that knowledge moves forward, that time is a reliable teacher, that what is lost is merely primitive compared with what came later. But every so often, an artifact appears that does not fit the story. Not because it proves ancient people were magical or because it asks us to abandon reason, but because it reveals how incomplete our confidence can be. Across the ancient world, from Roman harbors to Indian forges, from Assyrian temples to Egyptian tombs, there are materials that seem to carry an intelligence of making we do not easily explain. Some are stronger than expected. Some are finer, stranger, more durable, more exact. A few seem almost impossible, not because they break the laws of nature, but because they hint at methods, patience, and insight that slipped out of human memory. This is not a story about secret powers. It is a story about absence, about recipes lost with their makers, traditions broken by conquests, libraries burned, workshops silenced, meanings misfiled, and questions asked too late. If knowledge can vanish, then progress is not a straight road. It is a landscape of ruins and rediscoveries. And so we begin with a simple thought, one both humbling and strangely beautiful. Perhaps the past was not smaller than we imagine. Perhaps it was deeper. Perhaps in the fragments left behind, it is still trying to speak. It began at the edge of the sea, where stone met tide and empire met time. In the harbors of the ancient Mediterranean, Roman engineers poured a kind of concrete into wooden forms, often directly into salt water, trusting it to hold against storms, currents, and centuries. They built piers, breakwaters, and ports meant to serve an expanding world. By ordinary logic, the sea should have devoured them. Instead, many of those structures endured. Modern concrete is a paradox of strength and fragility. It can raise towers and bind cities together, yet water, salt, and time are always working against it. Steel corrodes, cracks widen, repairs become inevitable. But Roman marine concrete seems to have entered into a different relationship with the ocean. Rather than simply resisting the water, it appears to have used it. At the heart of this mystery is volcanic ash, mixed with lime and rock in proportions still studied with admiration. As seawater moved through the material, new minerals slowly formed inside it, strengthening the structure over time. It was not a miracle. It was chemistry guided by observation, by access to local landscapes, and by a practical wisdom that knew how to turn geology into infrastructure. The Romans may not have described the process in modern scientific language, but they understood enough to build for the future, and yet something was lost. Not the fact that they built, but the full continuity of how and why they built this way. Their formula was tied to place, to material sources, to labor systems, to traditions that did not survive unchanged. Today, researchers study those ancient harbors not to romanticize the past, but to learn from it. There is something quietly profound in that exchange. A civilization long gone still teaches us, not through words alone, but through the stubborn survival of what it made. Perhaps durability is not only a technical achievement, perhaps it is also a form of memory. What gives a sword its legend? Not only the battles it survives or the hands that carried it, but the strange feeling that metal itself can remember fire. In old accounts from the Middle East and South Asia, certain blades seemed almost alive in the imagination. Their surfaces rippled like water, their edges held with unnatural grace, and their balance suggested a maker who understood steel not as an industrial product but as a living discipline. These were the blades later associated with Damascus Steel, though the story behind that name is layered and incomplete. The finished swords became famous in markets and courts, but the material likely began much farther east, in crucibles where artisans produced high-carbon steel ingots known today as woots. Those ingots were traded, reforged, and transformed by smiths whose methods depended on temperature, timing, impurities, cooling rates, and a level of tactile judgment that modern analysis still struggles to fully translate into practice. Scientists have studied surviving examples for years, examining their microstructures, their carbides, their patterns, their remarkable combination of hardness and resilience. Some aspects can be approximated, some replicas come close. But the original chain of making was embedded in a world of local ores, handmade furnaces, inherited gestures, and slow refinement. Once those conditions disappeared, the material became more than a product lost to time. It became a missing conversation between matter and craft. What lingers is not just admiration for a superior weapon. It is respect for a way of knowing that lived in the hands as much as in the mind. A master smith may not have written a formula, yet he carried one in movement, in sound, in the color of heated metal, in the brief pause before the hammer fell. And that may be the deeper mystery. How much knowledge vanishes when it is never fully written down? A civilization can preserve objects for centuries, yet still lose the human rhythm that made them possible. The blade remains. The hands do not. It started with color, the kind that seems too vivid to belong to dust and ruin. In the tombs of Egypt, on the walls of Roman villas, and later in the icons and paintings of distant centuries, traces of a deep, luminous blue survived where other pigments faded into silence. It was not the blue of a passing flower or a temporary dye. It was something steadier, made by human hands yet strangely resistant to time. Today we call it Egyptian blue, and in many ways it was one of the first synthetic pigments in human history. Created by heating silica, copper compounds, calcium, and alkali to carefully controlled temperatures, it emerged from the furnace as a material both artistic and technical. Ancient makers were not simply copying nature. They were inventing a color that nature rarely offered in stable form, transforming raw minerals into a hue associated with divinity, night, water, and the horizon between worlds. What is remarkable is not only that they achieved it, but that they did so consistently enough for the pigment to travel across cultures and centuries. It required selection, calibration, and a disciplined understanding of heat. The process sounds straightforward when reduced to ingredients, yet replication is not so simple. Subtle variations in grain size, temperature, and preparation change the result. Ancient production seems to have relied on a level of control that feels surprisingly modern, even though it belonged to workshops lit by flame and governed by touch. And still, the mystery does not end with the recipe. Egyptian blue possesses properties that continue to intrigue scientists, including a kind of infrared luminescence invisible to the naked eye. A pigment made for beauty now reveals hidden images and forgotten details under modern instruments, as though it contained a second life all along. Perhaps that is why it feels so moving. A color once used to honor gods and decorate walls still speaks in wavelengths its makers never named. It reminds us that human creativity often outruns human explanation. We create first, understand later, and sometimes not completely at all. Imagine opening a burial chamber sealed for centuries and finding linen still wrapped around a body with impossible precision, as if time itself had been instructed to slow down. The fabric is dry but intact. The skin beneath it, though changed by death, still carries the outline of a person once mourned, once loved. It is easy to call this embalming and move on, but that word is too small for what the ancient Egyptians were doing. Mummification was not a single trick. It was a long, disciplined choreography of chemistry, ritual, and care. Natron salts drew moisture from the body. Resins, oils, waxes, and plant compounds sealed, scented, and protected. Linen was layered not only as wrapping but as architecture, building a final form that could endure the fragile violence of time. The result was neither purely spiritual nor purely technical. It was both at once shaped by belief in the afterlife and by a strikingly practical knowledge of decay. Modern science can identify many of the ingredients. It can analyze residues, reconstruct treatment stages, and explain why some bodies endured better than others. Yet there is still something elusive in the full success of the process. The specific combinations varied across centuries and classes. Methods changed, local materials mattered. So did climate, craftsmanship, and intention. What survives in museums today is the outcome of thousands of small decisions made by specialists whose expertise was part medicine, part devotion, part inherited art. What makes this material mystery so powerful is that it was never only about preservation. It was about continuity. To preserve a body was to resist oblivion, to insist that identity could cross a threshold the living could not yet understand. The materials serve that hope. And perhaps that is why these ancient wrappings still move us. Beneath the science lies a familiar human wish to keep something precious from disappearing. Not forever, maybe, but long enough to be remembered. In that sense, every mummy is more than a relic. It is an argument against forgetting. What happens when fire strikes sand with a force beyond any ordinary furnace? In a desert or along an ancient impact site, the answer can appear as glass, smooth, pale, and strangely beautiful, as if the earth briefly forgot it was stone. Long before scientists could describe the pressures involved, people encountered these hardened traces of extreme events and folded them into ornament, ritual, and wonder. One of the most haunting examples is desert glass, formed when intense heat fused silica into translucent material across barren landscapes. Its origin has been debated through the years: meteor impact, atmospheric explosion, or some combination of forces not easily repeated on command. What matters is that nature became, for a brief instant, an impossible workshop. The result was not merely geological debris. It was a material so striking that ancient Egyptians carved it into jewelry, even placing it in royal objects meant to accompany the dead. To modern eyes, glass feels familiar. We live among windows, screens, bottles, lenses. But this kind of glass belongs to a different order of making. It was not patiently blown by artisans or cast in controlled kilns. It was born from catastrophe, from an event so violent that the landscape itself was rewritten. And yet, from that violence came an object of elegance, carried by human hands into the realm of symbol. Scientists can study its composition, estimate temperatures, compare samples, and narrow the range of explanations. But there remains something almost philosophical in the material itself. It is a reminder that creation does not always come from intention. Sometimes the most exquisite substances emerge from disruption, from collisions too vast for anyone to witness and too rare to reproduce with ease. Perhaps that is why such glass feels less like an artifact than a message. It tells us that the world has always been capable of making things beyond our plans. Human beings did not create this beauty. We only recognized it, gathered it, and gave it meaning. In the end, that too is a kind of knowledge. There are stones that seem to belong to architecture, and there are stones that seem to challenge it. In the ancient Andes, walls built by Inca Masons still hold together with a precision that feels almost intimate, as if each block had learned the shape of its neighbor through patience rather than force. No mortar binds them, no modern cutting machine shape their faces. And yet the seams are so fine that even now they invite disbelief. These stones were not simply stacked, they were understood. Builders selected irregular blocks and fitted them into one another like pieces of a living terrain, creating walls that could absorb movement rather than resist it rigidly. In a land where earthquakes were not rare interruptions but part of reality itself, that flexibility mattered. The result was not only beautiful, it was resilient. Some colonial buildings rose later and fell. The older stonework beneath them often remained. How this level of precision was consistently achieved continues to stir debate. Theories range from careful abrasion with stone tools and sand to highly organized labor systems with extraordinary time devoted to shaping and testing. There is no need to invoke fantasy. Human skill, given discipline and generations of refinement, is more than enough to explain greatness. But explanation is not the same as mastery. Replicating the exact texture of that achievement, with its scale, efficiency, and elegance, is another matter. What was lost may not have been a secret technique so much as an entire culture of attention, a way of building that listened to gravity, to landscape, to the fault lines beneath daily life. The stones were not imposed on the mountain. They entered into conversation with it, and that may be why these walls still feel so alive. They do not boast. They endure. They suggest that sophistication is not always loud, and that true engineering sometimes hides inside humility. To fit one thing perfectly to another is not only a technical act, it is also a form of respect. What kind of metal survives not because it resists time, but because it learns how to live with it? In Delhi, beneath open sky and shifting seasons, an ancient iron pillar has stood for more than a millennium with surprisingly little corrosion. Rain has touched it, heat has abandoned it, air has wrapped around it year after year, and still it remains one of history's quietest metallurgical achievements. At first glance, iron seems an unlikely candidate for mystery. It rusts, it stains, it weakens. Entire industries have been built around protecting it from the ordinary chemistry of the atmosphere. Yet this pillar, forged in ancient India, behaves differently enough to keep drawing scientific attention. Its composition includes unusually high phosphorus and relatively low sulfur and manganese. And over time, these qualities appear to have helped form a thin protective layer on the surface, slowing further corrosion rather than inviting it. That explanation is real, but it is not the whole story. The pillar was not born in a laboratory. It came from a tradition of ironworking that required control over ore, furnace conditions, hammering, and large-scale forge welding. To produce a monument of this size and purity demanded organization, skill, and an understanding of metal that was practical rather than theoretical. The smiths who made it may not have spoken in the language of passivation in protective films, but their work shows an intimacy with material that modern observers still admire. What stands before us, then, is more than a relic of technical success. It is evidence that ancient metallurgy could be both symbolic and precise, ceremonial and deeply empirical. A pillar like this was not made only to stand. It was made to signify endurance. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden in its surface. Some things last because they are sheltered. Others last because they were shaped in such harmony with the world around them that time itself becomes less an enemy than a companion. In that sense, the pillar is not merely resisting decay. It is teaching us another way to think about strength. It began with a vessel no larger than a jar, lifted from the soil of ancient Mesopotamia and later surrounded by questions far larger than itself. At first glance, it seemed ordinary: a clay container, a copper cylinder, an iron rod. Nothing about it demanded myth. And yet, once assembled in the modern imagination, it became one of those objects that refuses to sit quietly in the past. Some have called it the Baghdad Battery, suggesting it may have functioned as a simple galvanic cell when filled with an acidic liquid. The idea is compelling because it makes the ancient world feel suddenly closer to our own, as if electricity had flickered at the edge of known history long before wires and grids transformed human life. Researchers and experimenters have shown that small voltages can indeed be produced using similar materials. The possibility is not absurd, but possibility is not proof. What makes this artifact so enduring is precisely that tension. It occupies the narrow space between evidence and projection, between what an object is and what we want it to mean. Was it used for electroplating, ritual, storage, something more ordinary that later generations misunderstood? The truth may be simpler than the legend, or stranger in a quieter way. Ancient materials often tempt us toward dramatic conclusions, when in fact their greatest lesson is patience. Even so, the artifact points to something important. Ancient craftspeople were often more experimental than we assume. They worked with metals, acids, dyes, heat, pressure, and mineral reactions in ways that blurred the modern boundary between artisan and chemist. Whether or not this vessel powered anything, it reminds us that curiosity itself is old, and perhaps that is the deeper current running through the mystery. Not the fantasy that the past secretly contained our future, but the recognition that human beings have always tested the world with their hands. We connect pieces, we notice reactions, we wonder what else might happen. Sometimes an unanswered object is valuable not because it solves history, but because it keeps history open. What survives longer, the object itself or the light it once held? In museums and ruined villas, archaeologists have uncovered tiny cups and droplets of a substance once more precious than most metals. To us, it is simply glass, common and transparent, a material of windows and bottles. But in the ancient world, glass was closer to controlled magic. It turned sand into clarity, fire into form, and color into permanence. Among the most intriguing examples is Roman glass, especially pieces whose chemical balance and craftsmanship still command respect. Some vessels were blown so thin they seem barely possible without modern tools. Others carry colors that remain vivid after centuries underground. And then there are rare cases of dichroic glass, objects that appear green in reflected light and red when illuminated from behind, as if the material cannot decide what it wants to be. The effect is now understood through the presence of tiny metallic particles suspended in the glass. Yet knowing that does not diminish the wonder. It deepens it. Ancient artisans did not have nanotechnology as a field of science, but they had practice, experiment, and repetition. They knew how small changes in ingredients and heat could transform the final result. Their workshops were places of close attention, where failure and success were measured by the eye, the breath, the timing of a turn, the glow inside a furnace before dawn. What they produced was not accidental beauty. It was disciplined unpredictability, shaped into vessels delicate enough to hold perfume, wine, or ritual significance. Modern science can replicate much of this, and in some ways surpass it. Yet replication is not the only measure of understanding. What remains hard to recreate is the full world behind the object, the economics, the apprenticeship, the trade routes, the slow accumulation of practical insight. A glass cup may seem fragile, but it carries a stubborn lesson. Human beings have long known how to coax wonder from ordinary matter. Sometimes the miracle is not that the object survived. It is that such refinement ever existed at all. What does a wall remember when the people who painted it are gone? In the ruins of ancient palaces and buried cities, fragments of plaster still cling to stone, carrying traces of reds, blacks, yellows, and whites arranged with a confidence that time has not fully erased. These surfaces were never meant to be admired as ruins. They belonged to living rooms, temples, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces filled with voices, smoke, footsteps, and daily light. Ancient plaster and pigment were more than decoration. In many cultures, especially around the Mediterranean, builders created wall surfaces through layered mixtures of lime, sandstone, volcanic material, marble dust, and mineral colors. The finest examples were polished until they seemed to glow from within. Frescoes bonded pigment to wet plaster in a way that made image and wall inseparable. The result could be both durable and intimate, turning architecture into memory made visible. Modern conservation science can identify ingredients and explain why some of these surfaces have endured. Lime chemistry plays its part, so does climate, burial, and luck. But what still escapes easy reproduction is the total effect. The subtle depth of finish, the way color settles into the material rather than merely resting on top of it, the sense that the wall itself has absorbed years of human presence. Ancient artisans worked in stages, timing each layer with care. Their success depended not only on materials, but on rhythm, touch, and a practical fluency that belonged to experience more than theory. These surfaces remind us that permanence is often built out of vulnerability. Plaster begins soft. Pigment begins as dust. Water evaporates. The wall dries. And yet from that fragile sequence comes something that can outlast empires. A room collapses, a city disappears, and still a painted fragment remains, carrying a mood no document can fully preserve. Perhaps that is why these ancient walls feel so moving. They do not just show us what people made. They show us what people wanted to live beside. Color, order, beauty, symbols that could hold meaning even as everything else changed. In the end, every painted wall is a quiet answer to time. It started with gold, not in the sense of wealth alone, but in the softer language of reverence. In tombs, temples, and ritual objects across the ancient world, gold appears again and again as if human beings had recognized something eternal in its refusal to tarnish. But pure gold is gentle, almost too gentle. To turn it into crowns, masks, amulets, and delicate ceremonial forms required more than admiration. It required metallurgy of surprising subtlety. Ancient goldsmiths understood that metal could be persuaded. By alloying gold with silver, copper, and trace elements, they altered color, hardness, and behavior. They hammered sheets so thin they seemed almost like skin. They joined pieces with methods still studied today, sometimes using surface treatments and diffusion techniques that created seamless effects without obvious solder lines. In places such as pre-Columbian South America, Egypt, and the Mediterranean, artisans developed ways of making gold appear richer, redder, brighter, or more pure than its core composition might suggest. What looks simple was often deeply intelligent. Modern analysis can identify these processes in fragments and finished pieces, yet the ancient workshop remains partly hidden. So much depended on judgment, the temperature of a charcoal fire, the pace of hammering, the timing of quenching, the patience to repeat a sequence until the metal yielded exactly the right response. There were no digital gauges, no industrial consistency, only trained senses moving through uncertainty with confidence earned over years. And perhaps that is what gives these objects their quiet power. They are not merely displays of luxury, they are records of attention. Gold may have symbolized immortality, sunlight, divinity, or kingship, but the making of it belonged to ordinary human labor. Breath over flame, hands darkened by soot, eyes fixed on a glowing edge. In that contrast lies something deeply moving. The most radiant objects in history were shaped by fragile people working close to heat and failure. Beauty did not descend fully formed. It was coaxed into being. And maybe that is why gold still holds us. Not because it shines, but because it remembers the hands that taught it how. What if the greatest material ever lost was not a metal or a stone, but a way of paying attention? By now, the pattern has become unmistakable. Across continents and centuries, ancient people made things that still unsettle our confidence. Concrete that grew stronger with seawater, steel that held a vanished discipline, pigments that outlived empires, glass born from catastrophe, iron that learned to resist decay, masonry that could move with the earth. None of these objects asks us to worship the past. They ask us to look at it more honestly. We are often tempted to treat lost materials as isolated marvels, each one a puzzle to be solved and then filed away. But taken together, they suggest something larger. Knowledge is not only stored in books, formulas, or diagrams. It also lives in habits, in communities of practice, in landscapes, in supply chains, in ritual, in repetition, in the quiet transfer of skill from one body to another. When those networks break, the object may remain while the intelligence behind it fades. That loss is not always dramatic. Sometimes it happens through war, conquest, famine, or fire. Just as often it happens more gently. A quarry is abandoned, a workshop closes, a master dies without an apprentice ready, a cheaper material replaces a finer one, and the old method drifts out of use. Centuries later, we find the result and call it mysterious. What we are really seeing is an absence with edges. And yet there is hope in that realization. If knowledge can disappear, it can also be rediscovered, not perfectly, but meaningfully. Science can analyze ancient matter, craft can learn from it, curiosity can rebuild bridges across time. The past does not return intact, but it does offer guidance. So perhaps the real lesson of these materials is neither nostalgia nor astonishment. It is humility. Human progress is real, but it is not linear. We move forward carrying fragments, forgetting as much as we preserve. The wonder is not that earlier people knew things we do not. The wonder is that across the silence of centuries, their work still teaches us how much more there is to learn. So where does that leave us, standing between museum glass and modern laboratory, between fragments of empire and the restless appetite of the present? Perhaps with a question larger than materials themselves. What kind of civilization do we become if we can measure almost everything, yet still fail to understand how knowledge is truly kept alive? The answer is not hidden in a single artifact. It is scattered across harbors, tombs, furnaces, workshops, deserts, and ruined walls, waiting for us to notice the pattern. These ancient materials endure because they were never just substances. They were relationships between people and place, between patience and technique, between belief and utility, between observation and imagination. Roman builders learned from volcanic earth and the sea. Smiths listened to heat and carbon. Painters turned minerals into memory. Masons shaped stone in dialogue with mountains and fault lines. In every case, matter became meaningful because human attention stayed with it long enough to learn its language. That may be the most enduring thread of all. The past is not a vault of miracles. It is a record of disciplined curiosity. Again and again, people working without modern instruments achieved forms of excellence, not by mastering nature from a distance, but by living close to it. They watched, adjusted, failed, repeated, and slowly built traditions that could outlast individual lives. When those traditions vanished, the objects remained like sentences from a lost book. And maybe that is why these materials continue to move us. They remind us that history is not only what happened, it is also what was forgotten, what was broken, and what still waits to be understood. In a world obsessed with speed, they ask us to respect duration. In a culture that prizes novelty, they ask us to honor continuity. In an age of information, they ask whether wisdom can survive without memory. The final mystery, then, is not how ancient people made such remarkable things. It is whether we still know how to preserve the conditions that make deep knowledge possible. Because the future, no less than the past, will one day be judged by what remains and by what our descendants can no longer recreate.